Okay, so this video is part 2 of 2 for our watershed model lesson. So ideally, by this point, you would have gone through your first lesson explaining each of these landscapes and how they contribute to pollution in Lake Champlain. And if you had the time, you would have cleared off your board and reset it for best management practices. If you didn't have time, maybe you had a second model set up, or you might just go through the best management practices with your first model if you don't have time to clean it off. So first we're going to start with our farm. So the main pollutants we're concerned about here are animal waste, fertilizers and pesticides, loose sediment, and any oil or chemicals coming off any of our farm equipment. So first, for the animal waste, we might put up some sort of fencing to keep the animals out of the lake from moving freely in and out of the water, going to the bathroom. That's something we'd like to avoid. So I just have this really tiny fence to give you an example. Ideally, you would have a fence that covers the whole length of the farm, but that's our fence. And then we might move on to our fertilizers and pesticides. So in a perfect world, we wouldn't use those at all, but that's difficult to implement for farmers since they need these crops to sustain their livelihoods. So we might try and push towards fertilizer, towards nitrogen and phosphorus free or low nitrogen phosphorus fertilizers and natural pesticides. Also just lowering the amount that we're using. And maybe not using them in certain times of the year when we see a lot of rain, like in the springtime. Another thing we might do is put vegetative buffer zones. So you're going to take your green strips and put them along the sides of your farm. So these basically act as a filter. These plants take in any nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, and they prevent them from entering our lake. So we put some of those strips down. The sponges work really well, so we might use some of those. So next we have the loose sediment. So oftentimes farms are not covered in vegetation year-round, especially with annual crops, things like corn. So we might want to put some sort of cover crop over the landscape during those times of year when we're not actively growing, to prevent some of that loose soil from going into the watershed. So here we have our cover crop that we're going to put right there on our farm. Next, we have our oil from our equipment. So the simplest solution to that is just to update your equipment. Make sure it's not leaking any oil. Okay, so next we have our factory, whatever your students decided it was. Maybe it's a Ben & Jerry's factory. So we might have some salt pollution on the driveway or in the parking lot. So the ideal situation would be to not use any salt at all, but maybe we could replace it with sand in a parking lot when it's not as necessary as it is on the roads. So maybe we put some sand in our parking lot to give some friction. We might also more heavily regulate the chemical waste that factories are allowed to emit and how well they should be treating that waste. We could implement incentive programs like tax breaks for properly treating waste, or decentivizing programs like fees and fines when companies aren't properly taking care of their waste. So next we have our roadways. The biggest pollution on our roadways is salt in the wintertime. So we ideally would like to substitute salt with sand whenever we can, but that's tricky because sand really only works as a friction. It doesn't really get rid of the ice as salt does, especially when we live in Vermont, and it can be really dangerous to drive on icy roads. So we would like to reduce the amount of salt we use as much as possible, substitute whenever possible, but we also might put some more vegetative buffers between our roads and our waters to absorb some of those pollutants before it gets into the water. And we also would like to plant some more trees along our waterways between the roads and the water, because trees have these really great strong root systems that hold on to any sediments, and that's going to prevent the soil from flowing into the lake and bringing with it any pollutants like salts and stuff like that. So we have some trees up here. So next we'll move to our water treatment center. The biggest concern here was overflowing, which means animal waste, detergents, anything that comes out of your sinks and your toilets and your shower. So that could overflow and go right into the lake because, as you can see, they're right next to, or in this case, they're right next to it's right next to the river. In downtown Burlington, it's actually right next to the lake, so overflowing is a pretty big issue. So we might want to build up the walls of our treatment center to prevent some of that. We also might maybe build it a little bit further away from the water and implement things like rain gardens and buffer zones to prevent some of that waste from getting into the river or the lake. So next we move on to our development. So the main pollutants here, we had oil from cars, salt on your driveway, pesticides, fertilizers, yard clippings, and animal waste from pets. So for animal waste, the best solution is just to pick up after your pets, people. Don't let that poop flow into the water. Nobody wants to swim in poopy water. So ideally you would just pick up the waste and throw it in the garbage. For salt in our driveways, the best thing to do is not use it, but if you have to use it, it's really important to clean it up at the end of the winter. Just take a broom, sweep it up, throw it in the garbage so that it doesn't flow into our water in the springtime when we see a lot of rain. For fertilizers and pesticides, ideally you would just not use it at all. If you're not growing crops for your livelihood, it's really not necessary. But if you have to use it, phosphorus and nitrogen-free fertilizers are a really great alternative, or any natural home remedies. It has been said that using seaweed can help keep slugs away. I'm not sure if it's true because I've never tried it, but I'm sure there's a lot of other remedies like that have been shown to work. Also using things like glue traps for rodents instead of harmful chemicals. Yeah, so those are some alternatives to using really harmful fertilizers and pesticides in your gardens. For yard waste, we would like people to just rake it up and put it in either your personal compost or bring it to a compost center. So the yard waste just puts a lot of nitrogen into our lakes and rivers, and it's really not ideal. So we hope that people will just use a rake, clean it up, don't just leave it out on your lawns to blow into the water. And for oil spills in the driveway, which happens a lot, I mean, ideally you would update your equipment so that you're not spilling, so that you're not leaking oil, but it does happen. So with oil spills, you can clean it up in your driveway with soap and water pretty easily, or you can use things like kitty litter or rice and just spray it or spread it on the oil stain, let it sit there for a couple hours, and then sweep it up and throw it in the garbage. So that's a really great way to clean up the oil stains, preventing it from leaving your driveway and entering our environment. Okay, so now we move on to our our construction site. So the main problem with the construction site was a lot of loose sediment that was just flowing into the river, bringing with it pollutants and just clogging up our waterways. So for this, the best solution is to just, you guessed it, plant some more vegetation around the construction site, especially trees, because like I said before, they have these really great root systems that hold on to sediment really, really well. So we might want to plant some more trees around the area. Be responsible with our construction projects. And last we had our Mountaintop, which might be Mount Mansfield, it might be Camel's Hump, whatever your class decided. And we had some deforestation problems up here, so the solution to that is, of course, reforestation. So we might plant some trees on our mountaintop, hold on to some of that soil, prevent it from flowing down the mountain. Okay, so the last thing I would do here is I would take my spray bottle and I would make it rain all over the model. I didn't actually put any pollutants on this model, so I'm not going to spray it because it's not really necessary. But with your class, you would spray it down and you would see some of these buffer strips absorb some of those pollutants, which is why the sponges work especially well. These vegetative strips don't really absorb as much, they just look a little bit more natural, but these sponges work really well for absorbing those nutrients, so I definitely use those wherever you can. And that is the end of our best management practices video, so good luck with your lesson.